Now that we have our edit together, I want to talk about color correction. So traditionally in our workflow, this is going to happen. It might happen simultaneously with the edit, but it's definitely not happening. We're not getting this sort of final frame look, especially with CG or VFX heavy stuff during production. We might have a LUT that we're adding while we're shooting a lookup table to sort of approximate what the color is going to be like. But you know, in our traditional workflow, this is happening towards the end. Now, what we can do here with our real-time iterative workflow is we can add a post-process volume. You can see I have mine here called PPV underscore color correction. We can add this into our level whenever we want at any phase. I mean, we can even put it during the gray box phase where we're just fleshing out the environment on a very standard sort of geometrical way. Now, I've had mine in here since the environment build stage. And I set sort of a baseline color correct. And the way I did that, the first thing that you gotta make sure you do is this is an actual volume. So if I pop out here and I press the game mode toggle, see this is an actual volume. But if I want this to sort of encompass the entire level, I need to make sure that this post-process volume for color correction is unbound. So if you go to the details panel, you type in unbound, you'll see infinite extent unbound here. So I've made sure that's checked because if I don't have that checked, the color correction and sort of, you know, all the image affectation that I'm doing will only occur within the bounds of this shape, this cubic shape. So I'm going to make sure that it is unbound, which means it will cover everything, including what we're seeing through the camera. So basically just the entire scene here. So let's go back into the camera for this frame. Press the G key to toggle game mode again, and we'll select our post-process volume here. So I'm going to just walk you through some of the settings that I have, and we'll go through them one at a time. So let's start with bloom. So I have bloom currently set to let's say 4.1. Let me round it down there. And this is essentially diffusion. This is diffusion based off luminance. This is sort of like having a pro mist filter on your scene here. The threshold value here is the minimum value, luminance value, before this bloom value here starts to actually take effect. So you can sort of audition these if you want. I'm going to leave that at default and leave this around 4.1 because I like this sort of dreamy look. You know, I don't want to go overboard there, but you know, I like it at around 4.14, which gives me a nice sort of diffuse magic magenta hour light here. So this, of course, is an extrasolar planet. This is not our own planet, but it has a nice enough atmosphere with a slightly different color shift for Magic Hour. I think this brings that across nicely. So if I go to exposure here, you know, if I was doing manual exposure mode, I could adjust some stuff in here. I could also, you know, adjust exposure compensation, stuff like that for the whole scene if I wanted. You know, like if I really wanted to make this a little bit darker or a lot brighter, I don't think there's any reason I'd want to go that bright. I can adjust that just with exposure compensation. And of course, I can also change the metering mode here, but I'm going to leave those off because I don't need to do any wholesale changes to this scene. Chromatic aberration here. This is going to give me that sort of fringe effect. If I want, you know, once again, I leave this relatively low. I do include it, but I usually leave it at a 0.3 or lower value for any of my renders. So, you know, there's other things like if I want to add a dirt mask texture, like an actual texture, you know, like if something has hit the lens and there's water or there's some sort of dust or dirt or scratches on the lens, I could put in a texture with an alpha channel here and adjust those values. I don't need that for this short, but if I wanted to do that, I could do that there. And then, of course, I could simulate some camera values here. Once again, not really necessary because I'm using a Cine Camera Actor where I can control those sort of things on that. Lens flares, I do leave this checked and set to 0 because sometimes, you know, you can change this to where it's not the default lens flare in the engine. You're not going to get like a streaky lens flare, but you can get some sort of blob shapes, which is kind of nice. I can adjust that if I want, but you know, I definitely don't need anything like that right now for this. So I'm going to leave that at 0. And then finally here for these sort of effects, we have our image effects. I've set my vignette by default to 0.8 and that, you know, already exists. You know, I could crank it up all the way to 1 and you can sort of see that circular shape right there, sort of closing in on itself, the iris sort of, the vignette iris sort of getting smaller and smaller. You know, but this is what it looks like without the vignette. So, I mean, I've sort of been working this entire time under the assumption that I'm using at least a 0.8 as I've been developing the look for my project. You can also, if you choose, you can add grain, intensity, right? It's way too high, but I want to put it at like a 0.1 to give it that sort of filmic look, and I can change the jitter value if I want, but I'm going to leave those off for now. Depth of field, I'm doing all that stuff in my camera, so I don't check anything there. And now we go to the actual color grading, and this is what you can do with the color correct itself. Let me collapse these so we can go through one at a time. So our white balance, this is our color temp. So you sort of run the gamut here. I can, once again, completely change the look and feel of this scene by shifting it all the way into those amber and oranges, the warm, warm look. Or I could go all the way down to like super, super cool, but that does not look like a habitable planet. So I'm going to leave it where I had it. And this was, once again, sort of adjusted during the environment build. If I wanted to do a complete tint shift, I could do that here. I've actually been a little bit excited about getting to this part because I think I do want to do a complete tint shift. I want to add a little bit more magenta in. So instead of leaving this at 0, I'm actually going I'm going to shift this to 0.2. And, it's a subtle difference, but it's allowing that sort of magenta atmospheric to sort of proliferate more throughout my frame here. Now under global, these are going to be color correct changes that affect, every aspect, highlights, midtones, and shadows. So basically global, it's literally what it sounds like. I have changed the global saturation value to 1.1. I've just boosted it a little bit because I just want this to feel a little bit more vivid. So I can use just the slider here to do an overall boost, or I can actually, mess around with the wheel here and target, ranges a little bit more specifically and do like some chromatic and hue shifts, which is pretty interesting. But I like to experiment with this just a little bit. I don't want to go too wild, but as you can see, this changes the look and feel of everything quite a bit. Because this could be something that we're familiar with. This sort of looks earthy, albeit a little bit too green. This looks a little bit more alien. This starts getting a little bit crazy. This looks like infrared almost. But, you can mess around with this and sort of find the sweet spot for what you like. And to me, adjusting this now, I'm liking about right here, actually, for this overall look. So I'm actually going to leave that right there. And, contrast, if I want it to be filmic, by default, I'm not going to go for super high contrast because I want to see detail. Even in the black levels or the black areas here, I can sort of, ride this however I see fit. But, I felt pretty good at 0.9. I don't think I'm going to change that. Now, one thing, of course, since we're doing this all in the engine, I don't have my histograms and scopes up to the scientific degree that I would be able to do this in, let's say, another dedicated color correction software. I'm mostly eyeballing this because this is taking place completely inside of the engine. The next thing that we have here is our gamma. The gamma value I can use to adjust intensity once again globally throughout this shot. I would be a little bit careful working with this because these minor increments cause massive changes here. But this is just a typical gamma adjustment that you'd find in any color correction software. So below that we have gain and offset. I don't have those checked. And then after that, we have our shadows, midtones, and highlights. So you'll once again get individual control over all 5 of these options here under your shadows, midtones, highlights. Under miscellaneous, you have your blue correction, but you also have, this is actually what I find to be very interesting. If you have a LUT, you can actually modify that for Unreal and import it into here and actually use a lookup table that you're familiar with or that you like or that you've created and actually have that feed into the color correction of your scene. And if you do have a LUT, you can change the intensity here and that would affect the look or the influence of the LUT on your actual scene up here. The last couple options we have here are our film options. For those of you familiar with cinematic color correction, we have the slope, toe, shoulder, black, and white clip. You sort of ride these values here to give it to sort of fine tune your cinematic look here. Normally I'm looking at these as a graph. I want to actually change the black clip or the white clip. Let's leave that as is. But, these are minute movements here. And, if you don't know what these are scientifically, I mean, what you see is what you get in regards to what we're seeing here in the viewport. So go ahead and, experiment, start messing around with these. If you are familiar with other third-party color correction software, you're going to feel right at home here. This isn't going to give you the fine-tuned, let's say there's no power windows here, we're not doing stuff like that. This is more in general sort of final frame overall workflows to get that final aesthetic touch and the color correct that you want. Some other things that we can add here, of course, are post-process materials. If you've created custom materials, like if you had a cell shader, so you wanted to give this sort of an animated film look with heavy lines and sort of splotchy color shapes or anything like that, you could write those shaders, create those materials, and actually add them as a post-process material so they'll be rendered after everything else is rendered and give you those sort of unique looks. So that would be done right here. We also have the ability to add in ambient occlusion. We have the slider here, so you can adjust those values. This is a post-process ambient occlusion, so this is not built in with the lighting. And, if you have ray tracing, if you're able to use ray tracing, you can adjust some of these settings. Now, some of these settings, though, are not going to work. Anything to do with global illumination is not going to work, if you don't have static lighting. So if we're using dynamic light, none of this stuff is going to work. You can see I'm changing these values. Absolutely nothing's changing. So that is something that you're going to need static lighting for. And that's when you have to decide, is the dynamic lighting for your final renders, for final frames? So we're talking when you're actually going to export, you're actually going to build this, package this into an interactive experience. Do you have static or dynamic light? Is that a part of how you're shipping this or how you're rendering that out? Because a couple more things are going to come into play when you do that. And a lot of lighting modifications are going to have to happen if you make that switch towards the final stages of your project. Lastly, in terms of the stuff that I want to cover in regards to what I'm using here, we have motion blur. And I'm just going to make sure that all of this is on. I usually leave it to default settings here. So that'll give us a nice cinematic motion blur here. Target FPS, sorry, I changed this to 24 to match my sequence. And if you have a lot of fast moving objects on screen or fast moving camera moves, it actually does make a huge difference if you do not have motion blur enabled. It sometimes seems a little bit too sharp and not as cinematic. So those are the main settings inside of the post-process volume that I'm using to sort of get my final aesthetic look here, my final frame. And once I've done this, the great part about this is, first of all, inside of this level itself with the color correction, any subsequent shot that I have, this is going to be applied. Unless I'm keyframing values for this by dropping it into a sequence, the values that I've created here inside of the details panel will work for every single shot inside of this master sequence and inside of this level. So when you do the color correction for one of your shots, you're really doing it, if you have a scene comprised of multiple shots, you're doing it for the whole scene, which is really convenient. Not to mention the fact too that you can always, if you want to carry this over into other scenes or levels, you can copy and paste that and use the default settings that you've created yourself to carry over your looks into other scenes or even to create a favorite.